In the dense jungles of Burma, during the darkest hours of 1944, a young British soldier lay perfectly still in his foxhole. His heart pounded so loudly he was certain the enemy could hear it. The night was alive with sounds. Insects chirped, leaves rustled, and somewhere in the distance a bird called out. But there was another sound, or rather the absence of sound, that made the hair on the back of his neck stand on end. Something was moving through the jungle with impossible silence. Then he felt it, a hand, gentle but firm, touching his boot. The soldier froze, his rifle gripped so tightly his knuckles turned white. He knew the drill. He didn't move. He barely breathed. The hand moved along his bootlaces, feeling the pattern, the way they were tied. A moment later the hand withdrew, and a whispered voice in heavily accented English said, "Friend, Gurkha." The British soldier exhaled slowly, his relief palpable. The Gurkha had been checking the bootlaces. You see, the Allied forces tied their boots differently from the Japanese, and in the pitch darkness of the Burmese jungle, this simple distinction between friend and foe could mean the difference between life and an unfortunate ending to a soldier's story. This ingenious tactic, this ability to move through enemy territory without making a sound, to identify targets through touch alone, and to strike with deadly precision before vanishing into the night, was just one of many skills that the Gurkhas brought to the British Army. And it was these very skills that would transform the fortunes of the Allied forces in one of the most brutal theaters of the Second World War. Welcome to an extraordinary story of warrior traditions, military innovation, and how a group of soldiers from the mountain kingdom of Nepal taught the British Army to fight in ways that would double their success rate and turn certain defeat into stunning victory. This is the story of why the Gurkhas taught the British to attack silently, and how that knowledge changed the course of history. Before we dive deeper into this remarkable tale, if you're enjoying this journey through history, please take a moment to hit that subscribe button and click the notification bell. Your support helps us bring you more stories of courage, innovation, and the unsung heroes who shaped our world. And don't forget to leave a comment below sharing which aspect of Gurkha military history fascinates you the most. To understand how the Gurkhas came to revolutionize British military tactics, we must first travel back to the early 19th century to the mountain fortresses of Nepal. In 1814, the British East India Company, confident in their military superiority, decided to expand their territory into the Himalayan kingdom. They expected a quick victory. What they encountered instead shook them to their core. The Gurkha warriors, descendants of the legendary warrior saint Guru Gorakhnath, fought with a ferocity and skill that the British had never witnessed. Despite being outnumbered and facing superior firepower, these hardy mountain men used the terrain to devastating effect. They struck without warning, disappeared before the British could mount a counterattack, and turned every engagement into a costly affair for the East India Company. The Anglo-Nepalese War, as it came to be known, lasted 2 years, and when it finally ended with the Treaty of Sugauli in 1816, the British had achieved a technical victory, but they had gained something far more valuable than territory. They had gained a profound respect for the Gurkha soldier, and more importantly, they had secured the right to recruit these remarkable warriors into their own ranks. British officers who had faced the Gurkhas in battle became their strongest advocates. They recognized that these men possessed qualities that couldn't be taught in any military academy. They had an innate understanding of guerrilla warfare, an ability to navigate treacherous terrain with ease, and a warrior spirit that valued honor above all else. General David Ochterlony and political agent William Fraser were among the first to propose formally recruiting Gurkhas, and in April 1815, even before the war had officially ended, the first Gurkha unit was formed under Lieutenant Ross. This would eventually become the first King George's own Gurkha rifles. But what truly set the Gurkhas apart wasn't just their bravery, though that was legendary. It was their mastery of silent warfare. Coming from the mountainous regions of Nepal, where survival often depended on one's ability to move quietly through dense forests while hunting or avoiding predators, the Gurkhas had developed skills that would prove invaluable in jungle combat. Their signature weapon, the kukri, exemplified their approach to warfare. This curved knife, with its distinctive forward-dropping blade, wasn't just a weapon. It was a multi-purpose tool that could clear brush, cut firewood, build shelters, and, when necessary, end lives with brutal efficiency. The kukri's design allowed for powerful, accurate cuts, and in the hands of a trained Gurkha, it was devastatingly effective in close-quarters combat. More importantly, it was silent. In an era of increasingly mechanized warfare, the Gurkhas understood that sometimes the old ways were the best ways. For over a century, Gurkha regiments served the British Empire with distinction across numerous campaigns. They fought on the northwest frontier of India, in Afghanistan and Burma, and during the Indian Mutiny of 1857, they proved their unwavering loyalty by standing firm when other units wavered. The 2nd Gurkha Rifles, alongside the 60th Rifles, famously defended Hindu Rao's house during the siege of Delhi, repelling 26 attacks and suffering casualties of 327 out of a force of 490. Such was their devotion that Queen Victoria herself designed a special truncheon to honor their service. But it was during the Second World War, in the steaming jungles of Burma, that the Gurkhas' particular skills would become not just valuable, but essential to Allied survival. When the Japanese launched their lightning campaign through Southeast Asia in December 1941, they seemed unstoppable. Singapore fell, Hong Kong fell, the Philippines fell, and by early 1942 the Japanese had driven the British out of Burma in what would become the longest retreat in British military history. The British and Indian forces that stumbled out of the Burmese jungle were demoralized, diseased, and defeated. They had been utterly outmatched by Japanese soldiers who seemed to own the jungle, who could move through impossible terrain, who attacked at night with devastating effectiveness. Field Marshal Sam Manekshaw, former Chief of Staff of the Indian Army, once said, "If a man says he is not afraid of dying, he is either lying or he is a Gurkha." This quote perfectly captured the spirit that the British Army desperately needed in their darkest hour. Among the forces that had retreated from Burma was a formation that would soon be reorganized into the 14th Army under the command of a remarkable officer named William Slim. Slim was not your typical British general. He came from humble origins, had risen through the ranks, and had served many years in India. Most importantly, he had commanded Gurkha units and understood their capabilities better than almost any other British officer. When Slim took command of the 14th Army in October 1943, he faced a seemingly impossible task. His men were demoralized, believing that the Japanese were invincible jungle fighters. They had been beaten badly, and they expected to be beaten again. The army was undersupplied, given low priority in a war where the focus was on defeating Germany first, and they were fighting in some of the most challenging terrain on Earth. Slim's genius lay not just in his tactical acumen, but in his understanding that the key to victory lay in changing the very way his army fought. And to do that, he turned to the Gurkhas. The first thing Slim recognized was that British soldiers had developed an irrational fear of the jungle. They viewed it as impenetrable, as enemy territory where they didn't belong. The Japanese, conversely, used the jungle as a friend, as cover for their infiltration tactics and surprise attacks. Slim needed to flip this paradigm entirely. He established a rigorous training program that sent units into the jungle for weeks at a time. But this wasn't just about familiarization with the terrain. It was about learning to fight in new ways. And who better to teach these methods than the Gurkhas, who had been doing it for generations? The training emphasized several key principles that the Gurkhas had perfected. First and foremost was the importance of night operations. The Japanese had used night attacks to great effect, striking when visibility was minimal and panic was maximum. British soldiers, trained primarily for conventional warfare, had struggled to respond effectively. The Gurkhas, however, were masters of the night. Gurkha instructors taught British soldiers how to move silently through dense vegetation. This involved everything from how to place your feet to avoid snapping twigs, to how to breathe quietly, to how to communicate with hand signals that could be understood in near total darkness. They taught the famous bootlace identification technique, where soldiers would feel the pattern of bootlaces to determine if they were touching friend or foe. They demonstrated how to approach enemy positions without making a sound, how to eliminate sentries quietly, and how to withdraw just as silently. The impact was transformative. Before the adoption of these tactics, British night operations were often disasters, with men getting lost, accidentally firing on their own positions, or making so much noise that any element of surprise was completely lost. After implementing Gurkha methods, the success rate of night operations improved dramatically. According to various accounts from the Burma campaign, units that adopted these silent approach tactics saw their raid success rates increase significantly, with some reports suggesting improvements of 50 to 100% in achieving mission objectives without being detected. But silent movement was just one aspect of what the Gurkhas brought to the table. They also revolutionized the concept of offensive patrolling. Slim understood that sitting in defensive positions and waiting for the Japanese to attack was a losing strategy. Instead, he implemented aggressive patrolling tactics that kept the enemy off balance. Gurkha patrols became legendary for their effectiveness. They would venture deep into Japanese-held territory, gather intelligence, and strike at supply lines and communication routes. Their ability to remain undetected while moving through areas crawling with enemy soldiers was almost supernatural. Stories abounded of Gurkha patrols that passed within feet of Japanese sentries without being noticed. One particularly famous tactic involved infiltrating enemy camps at night. Gurkhas would slip past the perimeter guards, enter the camp itself, and selectively eliminate targets while leaving others untouched. There are accounts of Gurkhas entering a tent where 3 enemy soldiers slept, disposing of the 2 on the ends while leaving the middle one alive, with his bootlaces cut as a chilling message. The psychological impact of such tactics was enormous. The Japanese, who had prided themselves on their martial prowess and Bushido warrior code, found themselves being hunted by an enemy they couldn't see, couldn't hear, and couldn't stop. This psychological warfare component was crucial. By 1944, Japanese soldiers who had once been supremely confident in their jungle fighting abilities began to fear the night. They knew that Gurkhas were out there, silent and deadly, and this fear eroded their combat effectiveness just as surely as any direct attack. The 14th Army, under Slim's leadership, also adopted the Gurkha philosophy of treating the jungle as a friend rather than an enemy. This meant learning to use its features for concealment and tactical advantage. Slim instituted what he called the defensive box tactic. When Japanese forces infiltrated and surrounded a position, instead of retreating as previous tactics dictated, the surrounded force would form a defensive box and call for aerial resupply. This was revolutionary because it turned the Japanese infiltration tactics against them. Now it was the infiltrators who were surrounded, cut off from their own supply lines, while the British were resupplied by air. During the critical battles of Imphal and Kohima in 1944, these tactics proved decisive. These twin battles, often called the Stalingrad of the East, were the turning point of the entire Burma campaign. The Japanese had launched Operation Hugo, intending to invade India itself. They committed 85,000 troops to the offensive, including some of their best divisions. What they encountered was an Allied force that had been transformed by Gurkha training and Slim's leadership. The defenders at Kohima and Imphal employed night operations, aggressive patrolling, and the defensive box tactics to devastating effect. Despite being surrounded and outnumbered, they held their ground. The statistics from these battles tell a compelling story of the transformation. Of the 85,000 Japanese soldiers who crossed the Chinwen River in March 1944, less than 30,000 returned. They suffered over 53,000 casualties, with the majority caused by starvation, disease, and exhaustion, as the Allied forces cut their supply lines through relentless patrolling. Allied casualties, while significant at around 17,000, were a fraction of the Japanese losses. This was an unprecedented reversal. An army that had been soundly defeated 2 years earlier had not only stopped the Japanese advance, but had utterly destroyed their offensive capability. The British National Army Museum would later vote the battles of Imphal and Kohima as Britain's greatest battle, surpassing even D-Day and Waterloo. The role of the Gurkhas in this transformation cannot be overstated. Gurkha battalions were present throughout the campaign, serving in every major engagement. They fought at Sangshak, where the 153rd Gurkha Parachute Battalion held off overwhelming Japanese forces. They served in the Chindit long-range penetration groups that wreaked havoc behind Japanese lines. They won numerous Victoria Crosses for acts of extraordinary valor. Take the story of Rifleman Lakshman Gurung of the 8th Gurkha Rifles. On the night of May 12, 1945, at Taungdao in Burma, his position was attacked by at least 200 Japanese soldiers. Gurung, standing only 4 feet 11 inches tall and manning the most forward post, faced a barrage of grenades. He threw back 2 enemy grenades before a third exploded in his hand, blowing off his right hand, shattering his right arm, and severely wounding his face and body. Despite these horrific injuries, Gurung continued to fight. Loading and firing his rifle with his left hand alone, he held off wave after wave of attackers throughout the night. When dawn broke, 31 enemy bodies lay in front of his position. He had held the line alone, preventing a breach that could have resulted in catastrophic losses. Or consider Rifleman Banbhagta Gurung of the 2nd Gurkha Rifles. On March 5, 1945, during an attack on a Japanese position known as Snowdon East, his section came under devastating fire. Pinned down by machine guns, grenades, and mortars, with a sniper systematically picking off his comrades, Gurung stood up in full view of the enemy and calmly shot the sniper. He then charged forward alone, clearing 5 enemy foxholes with grenades and bayonet. Running out of ammunition, he assaulted the final bunker with only his kukri and 2 smoke grenades, eliminating the occupants in hand-to-hand combat. He then held the position against counterattacks until reinforcements arrived. These weren't just isolated acts of bravery. They were examples of the Gurkha warrior spirit that permeated the entire 14th Army. British soldiers training alongside these warriors absorbed their tactics, their mindset, and their indomitable will to win. The fear that had once paralyzed them was replaced by confidence, and the belief that the Japanese were unbeatable was shattered. The silent tactics that the Gurkhas taught extended beyond just night raids. They encompassed an entire philosophy of warfare that emphasized intelligence gathering, psychological operations, and precision strikes over brute force. British and Indian soldiers learned to read the jungle, to track enemy movements through subtle signs, to set ambushes with deadly effectiveness, and to control the tempo of combat, rather than simply reacting to enemy actions. One of the most significant impacts was on the training pipeline itself. In 1943, recommendations were made to increase basic training for recruits to 11 months, with 2 months specifically dedicated to jungle warfare training. Training manuals were created, including one aptly titled The Jungle Book, which codified many of the tactics that Gurkha soldiers had practiced for generations. These manuals instructed commanding officers on jungle craft, physical fitness tailored for jungle operations, marksmanship techniques suitable for close-quarters combat, and decentralized command structures that allowed small units to operate effectively when cut off from higher headquarters. The results were dramatic. Units that had previously been massacred in jungle engagements began consistently outperforming their Japanese counterparts. Success rates in ambushes improved significantly. Casualties from friendly fire incidents dropped, as soldiers became more comfortable with night operations, and the overall combat effectiveness of the 14th Army increased measurably. General Slim himself credited much of his success to the Gurkha influence. In his famous memoir, Defeat into Victory, he wrote extensively about the transformation of his army and the crucial role that jungle warfare training played. He noted that the key wasn't just learning new tactics, but changing the entire mindset of his soldiers. They needed to believe they could win, and that belief came from mastering skills that gave them tangible advantages. The offensive that followed the defensive victories at Imphal and Kohima showcased just how transformed the 14th Army had become. Slim launched a masterful campaign to retake Burma using all the tactics that his men had learned. His forces crossed the Irrawaddy River, captured the strategic city of Meiktila, and took Mandalay. By May 1945, Rangoon was back in Allied hands. Throughout this campaign, Gurkha units were at the forefront. Gurkha paratroopers dropped on Elephant Point as part of Operation Dracula, the amphibious assault on Rangoon. They used flamethrowers to dislodge stubborn Japanese defenders and cleared the way for the naval forces. The 700 Gurkha paratroopers who made this drop exemplified the combination of airborne assault tactics with traditional Gurkha skills. The legacy of what the Gurkhas taught the British extended far beyond the Second World War. The Jungle Warfare School, originally established at Kota Tinggi and Johore, Malaysia, continues to train soldiers today, with the current facility located in Brunei. The Royal Gurkha Rifles maintains a battalion there specifically to train British soldiers in jungle warfare capabilities, passing down the same skills that proved so decisive 80 years ago. During the Malayan Emergency from 1948 to 1960, those jungle warfare skills were put to use again. Gurkha battalions provided the backbone of the counterinsurgency campaign against communist terrorists, serving for the entire 12-year conflict while other British units rotated in and out. Their expertise in stealth, tracking, and jungle operations was decisive in what military historians call a rare example of successfully defeating an insurgency. The Borneo confrontation of the 1960s saw Gurkhas once again employing their silent tactics to devastating effect. Operating in dense jungle along the Indonesian border, Gurkha patrols conducted covert operations that kept Indonesian forces off balance and prevented larger incursions. Even in more recent conflicts, the principles that the Gurkhas taught have remained relevant. In Afghanistan, Gurkha units adapted their traditional skills to the mountain terrain of the Hindu Kush. Their ability to move quietly through difficult terrain, to observe without being observed, and to strike with precision made them invaluable assets in counterinsurgency operations. But perhaps the most enduring legacy is the way that Gurkha tactics revolutionized military thinking about asymmetric warfare. The concept of using stealth and precision rather than overwhelming firepower, of turning the enemy's perceived advantages against them, of psychological warfare and disruption of supply lines, these ideas that the Gurkhas had practiced for centuries became incorporated into military doctrine worldwide. Modern special operations forces owe a debt to the Gurkha tradition. The emphasis on small unit tactics, silent approach techniques, night operations, and the ability to operate independently in hostile territory all trace their lineage, at least in part, to the lessons learned in the jungles of Burma. It's worth pausing here to consider what made the Gurkha approach so effective. At its core, it was about understanding that warfare isn't just about firepower and numbers. It's about psychology, about using terrain and conditions to advantage, and about exploiting the enemy's weaknesses rather than directly confronting their strengths. The Japanese in Burma had proven themselves masters of the jungle. They had used it to devastating effect in their conquests, but the Gurkhas were even better. They had been born in the mountains and forests, had grown up tracking through dense vegetation, had learned from childhood how to move without being detected. When they taught these skills to British soldiers, they weren't just teaching techniques, they were imparting a philosophy of warfare that emphasized intelligence over brute force, stealth over spectacle, and precision over profligacy. This approach doubled success rates not through any single magical technique, but through a comprehensive transformation in how operations were conceived and executed. Night raids that previously failed 50% of the time due to detection began succeeding at rates of 80 to 90%. Ambushes that once had difficulty achieving surprise now consistently caught enemy forces off guard. Patrols that previously were detected and engaged ineffectively began penetrating deep into enemy territory, gathering intelligence, and returning safely. The statistics from the Burma campaign speak volumes. Before the adoption of Gurkha tactics and Slim's training reforms, the British and Indian forces suffered defeat after defeat, losing Burma and barely preventing the invasion of India. After the transformation, they achieved one of the most complete victories of the Second World War. The Japanese 15th Army was destroyed as an effective fighting force. Their losses were so severe that they never recovered, and the road was opened for the reconquest of all of Southeast Asia. Field Marshal Bill Slim would go on to become one of the most respected military commanders in British history. His memoir, Defeat into Victory, is still studied in military academies around the world. But he always credited his men, particularly the Gurkhas, for the transformation that made victory possible. He understood that leadership alone wasn't enough. You needed men who knew how to fight, and the Gurkhas were masters of their craft. The bond between the British Army and the Gurkhas continues to this day. The Brigade of Gurkhas remains an integral part of the British military, with soldiers still recruited from the hill villages of Nepal. The selection process is incredibly competitive, with thousands of young Nepali men competing for just a few hundred spots each year. Those who are selected undergo rigorous training that combines modern military techniques with traditional Gurkha skills. The kukri remains the symbol of Gurkha units worldwide, a reminder of their heritage and their approach to warfare. Every Gurkha soldier is trained in its use, and it continues to be carried as both a tool and a weapon. The sight of the kukri still evokes respect and, in some quarters, fear. As we reflect on this remarkable story, several lessons emerge that remain relevant today. The first is that military superiority isn't always about having the biggest guns or the most advanced technology. Sometimes it's about having the right skills and the right mindset. The Gurkhas, with their curved knives and mountain heritage, helped defeat one of the most technologically advanced militaries of the time because they understood principles of warfare that transcended technology. The second lesson is about the value of learning from others. The British officers who first fought against the Gurkhas in 1814 could have dismissed them as primitive warriors from a backward kingdom. Instead, they recognized excellence when they saw it and sought to incorporate that excellence into their own forces. That openness to learning, that willingness to admit that others might know better, was crucial to their ultimate success. The third lesson concerns adaptation and innovation. Slim didn't simply tell his soldiers to fight like Gurkhas. He took Gurkha principles and adapted them to the broader context of the Burma campaign, combining them with air support, mechanized forces, and modern logistics. The result was a uniquely effective approach that neither purely traditional nor purely modern forces could have achieved alone. And finally, there's the lesson about the human element in warfare. All the tactics and training in the world mean nothing without soldiers willing to execute them under the most trying conditions. The Gurkhas brought not just skills but spirit to the 14th Army. Their legendary courage, their refusal to accept defeat, their warrior ethos that valued honor above life itself, these qualities were infectious. British soldiers fighting alongside Gurkhas found themselves elevated, pushed to match the standards of their comrades. As we come to the close of this narrative, let us remember the Gurkha Welfare Trust's reminder of what these warriors have meant to Britain. Over 190 years of loyal service, countless lives sacrificed in Britain's wars, and a legacy of martial excellence that has enriched the British military tradition immeasurably. The next time you think about the Second World War, remember not just the beaches of Normandy or the skies over Britain, but the dense jungles of Burma, where men fought in impossible conditions, where the night held terrors beyond imagination, and where a group of mountain warriors from Nepal taught their British comrades how to move like shadows and strike like thunder. Remember the silent patrols through pitch-black jungle, the careful feeling of bootlaces to distinguish friend from foe, the gleam of Gurkhas in the moonlight, and the fearless charges of men who believed that death in battle was far preferable to dishonor. Remember that these tactics, these ancient skills passed down through generations of Himalayan warriors, helped turn the tide of one of history's greatest conflicts. The story of why the Gurkhas taught the British to attack silently is ultimately a story about respect, adaptation, and the timeless truth that the greatest warriors aren't always those with the most advanced weapons, but those with the deepest understanding of their craft. The Gurkhas possessed that understanding, earned through centuries of mountain warfare, and when they shared it with their British comrades, they helped create a fighting force that would achieve what many thought impossible. The jungles of Burma have long since reclaimed the battlefields where these epic struggles took place. The foxholes have filled in, the supply routes have been overgrown, and the defensive boxes where men fought for their lives are now covered in vegetation. But the legacy of what happened there endures. Today's soldiers, whether training in Brunei's jungle warfare school or deploying to the mountains of Afghanistan, carry with them the lessons that the Gurkhas taught. Move silently, strike precisely, use the terrain, maintain the initiative, never give up. And perhaps most importantly, remember that in warfare, as in life, it's not always the strongest or the most technologically advanced who prevail, but those who are smartest, most adaptable, and most determined. The Gurkhas understood this truth, and they shared it freely with their British comrades. In doing so, they helped win a war, forged an unbreakable bond of military brotherhood, and created a legacy that continues to influence military thinking to this day. For those interested in learning more about this fascinating chapter of military history, I encourage you to explore the resources available at the Gurkha Museum in Winchester. Visit the Commonwealth War Graves Commission cemeteries at Kohima and Imphal, or read the accounts of those who were there. The stories of individual heroism, the detailed accounts of specific operations, and the personal testimonies of the soldiers who fought provide depth and detail that bring this history to life. And if you've made it this far in our exploration of this remarkable story, thank you for your attention and your interest in these crucial but often overlooked chapters of history. If you found this narrative valuable, please consider sharing it with others who might appreciate learning about the incredible contributions of the Gurkhas to military history. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a comment below with your thoughts on what aspect of Gurkha military tradition you find most impressive. The story of the Gurkhas and their influence on British military tactics is one that deserves to be remembered and honored. These warriors, who came from a small mountain kingdom, changed the course of one of history's greatest conflicts through their skill, their courage, and their willingness to share their hard-won knowledge with their allies. In the silent depths of the jungle, in the careful placement of a foot on the forest floor, in the patient observation from a hidden position, the spirit of the Gurkhas lives on. And for as long as there are soldiers who value skill, honor, and courage above all else, that spirit will continue to inspire and inform the art of war. Jai Mahakali, Ayo Gurkhali. Hail to the great goddess Kali, the Gurkhas come. This is the traditional battle cry of the Gurkha soldier, a cry that has struck fear into enemies for over 2 centuries. It is a reminder that these are not ordinary soldiers, but warriors carrying a tradition that stretches back through the mists of time, to the mountain fortresses of Nepal, to the warrior saint Gorakhnath, and to a code of honor that values death in battle over life in dishonor. May we never forget what they have taught us, and may we always honor their sacrifice and their legacy. For in their story, we find not just a tale of military innovation, but a profound lesson about the human spirit, about the bonds that form between warriors who fight side by side, and about the timeless truth that sometimes the greatest strength lies in knowing how to move in silence. The Gurkhas taught the British to attack silently, and in doing so, they helped them find their voice again as a victorious army. It is a lesson and a gift that echoes through the decades, as relevant today as it was in the steaming jungles of Burma 80 years ago. This concludes our journey through one of military history's most fascinating stories. Until next time, keep exploring history, keep asking questions, and remember that the greatest lessons often come from the most unexpected teachers.